Hey everybody, and welcome to It's Paulish, how 5 different letters became Second Corinthians. We're going to be going over some of the newest parts of New Testament studies here today, so if this sounds different from what you've heard before, that's because it's different from what you've heard before. This is research that's only come out in the last 10, 15 years, so in the field of New Testament studies, that's new. So we'll be going over what people think of Second Corinthians, some background on Corinth, when people think the letter was written, and how these 5 different letters became Second Corinthians, and also what the 5 letters are and what pieces of Second Corinthians constitute the different letters. So let's start with what's a Corinthian? A Corinthian is a person who lives in Corinth. Corinth was a bustling metropolis in the Roman Empire. It was originally established by ancient Greek peoples. However, that city collapsed. But then in 44 BCE, Julius Caesar, you may have heard of him, refounded the city and populated it with freed slaves. So we'll get back to the freed slave part in a minute. But then in 27 BCE, Caesar Augustus named Corinth the capital of the Roman province of Achaia. So that means it's a huge city, right? It's the capital of that province. It would have had a multitude of people. It was like a huge economic metropolis based on where it was, because instead of taking another dangerous route, people could just go to Corinth and goods could be shipped north to south or east to west. So you can get wherever you need to go safely by going through Corinth. Now, as I said, it was populated with freed slaves, formerly freed slaves. So that initial population of freed slaves may also be why in Paul's time it was home to a population with upwardly mobile social aspirations, right? These are people that either were freed slaves or come from families of freed slaves. So the idea of proving themselves socially is one that's completely understandable. However, we know from particularly the letter of First Corinthians that caused a lot of problems and frictions and misunderstandings within this early Jesus community. So when were the 5 letters written? Well, it used to be people would look at Acts as kind of a timeline, but really modern scholarship has kind of blown that out of the water. Acts is actually a later source is actually a later story that used Paul's letters as a source to write it. Now we know this because a whole host of reasons, and this isn't really an Acts workshop, but the gist is the person who wrote Acts is willing to use Paul's letters as a source, but when you compare the theology and teachings and what's going on in Paul's letters to what's going on in Acts, the author of Acts was willing to use Paul's letters as kind of part of his timeline, but was willing to switch up the theology and even some of what we would call the history to suit his own needs. For example, if you look in Acts and Galatians when it comes to Peter and keeping kosher, you get 2 very different images. Back to Paul. So we know while he was in Ephesus, Paul wrote several letters to the Corinthians between 52 and 55 CE, of which 1 Corinthians is the second one, which we know, was the second about which we know. So there was a first letter he wrote. What we know as 1 Corinthians is actually the second letter. And then in 1 Corinthians, because Paul mentions that earlier letter in 1 Corinthians. So anyway, there's a letter that goes, here's that out. So how do we know that these are 5 letters? Well, if you do a close reading of 2 Corinthians, you really see the problematic nature. There's a lot of discrepancies and inconsistencies. Paul is very consistent in his writing. When an inconsistency pops up, you know something is going on that he did not intend. Additionally, part of what makes this letter suspect is the earliest text we have of 2 Corinthians comes from the 3rd century, which isn't all that weird for Scripture, but the earliest mention, which is weird, of anything that what we know about anything we know from 2 Corinthians comes from around 140 CE. So that's very late. We have lots of letters from church fathers quoting other pieces of Scripture. We may not have the text of that Scripture until later, but we have quotes and things like that from earlier, so we know, for instance, the Gospels are later than 140, or earlier than 140. This one, we don't have a quote from anything in 2 Corinthians until 140. If Paul wrote the Corinthian correspondence, which we know from 1 Corinthians, which is genuinely Paul, if Paul wrote the Corinthian correspondence in the mid-50s of the 1st century, then there was a considerable amount of time in which a number of shorter letters could have become combined into one major letter. Now, Paul has a specific format, which is another way we know his writing style. We know that 2 Corinthians is suspect, and it's how scholars have been able to piece together these 5 letters. Paul always starts with a greeting. There's always a prayer. There's always then the body, which is where he'll have his sermon, argument, request, whatever, and then a closing. And always, 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 there's thematic consistency. Paul has a point. He does well laid out arguments. So when you have themes jumping around, that's a red flag. For example, although 2 Corinthians starts off with a note of reconciliation in chapter 1, 3 through 7, 2:14 abruptly changes the momentum of the letter. Another thanksgiving has been inserted into what was a developing letter of reconciliation. What follows in 2:14 to 6:13, that's what follows in 2:14 to 6:13. Then 7:2 through 4 stands in contrast to the tone, language, and rhetoric of the letter's beginning. A conflict apparently is budding, yet Paul seems to be confident in resolving the matter. Indeed, he seems to be using some of the terms of his opposition in making his case. Although Paul uses Scripture to demonstrate his point, the format of this section seems closer to a political speech than a letter of reconciliation. So we've got several themes bouncing around all over the place. So in total, there's actually 6 distinct sections or fragmentary letters in 2 Corinthians. Now, you've heard me talk about 5. The title of this is 5. That's because only 5 of these sections are Paul. A 6th, we know, is manifestly not Paul. Everybody agrees with that. It's 6:14 through 7:1. So what are these 5 different letters? So a probable timeline and how all this works. After finishing 1 Corinthians and after Timothy's visit, which is talked about in 1 Corinthians, Paul decided to modify his previous plans and sent Titus to Corinth to speed up the collection for Jerusalem. This is done with the Corinthians' cooperation. Then, other Jesus missionaries, emphasizing their Judaic origin, arrive in Corinth, taking the Pauline community as their base of operations. In their role as envoys, they sow doubts about Paul's competence and authority. Paul responds with letter 1. You can see the corresponding scripture up on the screen. But this is ironically unsuccessful. He wins the battle but loses the war. The Corinthians are impressed by the performance, but the Corinthians are impressed by the performance of the letter. Yet a personal visit turns into a disaster. Paul evidently cannot compete on the terms set by the new envoys. The opposition is at its peak, and Paul is ruthlessly attacked. After leaving Corinth, he sends letter 2, in which he takes the Corinthians and outside agitators to task. Titus has been sent to Corinth again, but before he returned, Paul had been arrested and imprisoned for several months. Upon his release, Paul hastens to Troas, then to Macedonia, where Paul meets Titus and learns that the situation is vastly improved. Paul sends letter 3 to clarify the response that should be made to the person who offended Paul and to explain his failure to visit Corinth on his way to and from Macedonia. In letter 4, Paul finds Titus willing to resume the matter of the collection and sends him along with 2 other delegates. This letter is a letter of appeal specifically to the Corinthians. After their departure, Paul sends another letter, this one to the communities in all of Achaia. If there is any accuracy in Acts in regard to this situation, which again is iffy and suspect, Paul finally visits Corinth again and stays there for several months. So, in closing, what I hope we can get out of this is, 1, a challenge to read these letters as they were originally written, these 5 different letters. 2, to draw some comfort. I think, if there's any reason for the Corinthians to be in Scripture, is to draw comfort from the fact that church has never been, following Jesus has never been easy. Jesus communities since the first century have had their issues, and they've come through them. The Corinthian church, we know, was around for the next couple centuries. There are still Christians in Corinth. So no matter what is going on in our churches, we know that as long as we're open to the Spirit and we're committed to the mission, we can get through it. The other takeaways is we need to have a certain mindset when we approach these ancient documents. I've talked about this before. These are pre-printing press, pre-copyright writings. Errors happen, things like that. 2 Corinthians is a little bit of an outside case in that it's 5 letters. Who did it? How did it happen? That is still debated. I tried to look up some sources on this to confirm it, but as I remember, the leading candidate is a guy named Marcion, who actually put together the first canon of scripture surrounding Jesus, but he was perfectly happy to edit the heck out of them. He chopped up and edited Luke to take away any references to the Old Testament or Judaism, because he believed that the God of Jesus was a different God from the God of the Old Testament, who was evil, and the New Testament God was great. And he was all about Paul because of Paul's writings on his understanding of the law and being open to Gentiles. Now, Paul was not rejecting the law. Paul was proudly Jewish, so the idea that Paul would have supported this is pretty much nonsense, because this guy was also happy to edit Paul's writings to take out all the Old Testament references. So it's likely he's the one that pasted this together. But again, that's in some ways circumstantial. So we're not sure who did it, but we do know it was done. So with that, I look forward to the sermon series coming up, where we're going to take each of these letters one at a time. And I hope you're interested and excited about this, and I hope it empowers you to flip open 2 Corinthians, and hopefully in some ways it'll make more sense, and hopefully it'll open up the scripture for you.